The beginning lies in the slow breath of the Yazoo River, in that twilight hour when the water no longer reflects the sky but absorbs it, drawing every stray color downward into a muted, trembling mirror. The land here has always been a place of crossings. Long before settlers carved paths through the canebrakes, long before traders rattled their wagons across the soft earth, the river shaped the lives of all who lingered near it. Those who lived along its banks often spoke of the strange silence that hung over the woods at dusk, a silence so complete that even the call of an owl felt like an intrusion. In that silence, stories grew as easily as vines, and out of those stories rose the shadow of the woman who would one day be known as the evil witch of Yazoo. Her true name drifts beyond recovery, carried away by generations of telling and retelling, but the echoes of her presence remain, woven into the soil, the trees, and the river fog. She did not appear suddenly. She surfaced the way a distant figure takes shape through mist, slowly, gradually, until one day she was simply there. Early accounts spoke of a solitary woman living deep in the woods, closer to the river bend than anyone else dared to dwell. People saw her hut in flashes, often when the sun fell low and set the trunks of the trees ablaze with amber light. She moved like someone accustomed to silence and shadow, a figure who understood the moods of the land more intimately than the communities forming nearby. Some believed she was a healer who had left another settlement behind. Others said she fled a past no one could name. A few insisted she was entirely ordinary, made extraordinary only by the fear of those who did not understand her way of living. Yet none of these explanations captured what the people of Yazoo truly felt when they spoke of her. Her presence stirred something older than superstition. It stirred unease born from the frontier itself, where each person carried both hope and suspicion across the wilderness. In such places, those who lived alone became objects of wonder or dread, sometimes both. Her earliest nickname was not witch. It was a quieter term, shaped by the tongues of settlers who preferred caution over accusation. They called her the Woman of the Woods. Later, when cattle wandered too near the river and did not return, when a child went missing for half a night before being found unharmed, when a sickness moved through a cluster of cabins with no discernible cause, her nickname began to darken. People murmured at first, under firelight, while the smell of pine smoke clung to their clothing. They spoke about the tracks found near her dwelling, the strange bundles hanging from trees, the feeling that the woods watched them as they passed. Such things were common in any forest, yet in Yazoo the land seemed eager to carry stories forward. Tales drifted down the river faster than boats. Some claimed she could speak to animals. Others said she knew the secret names of plants. Soon her nickname grew teeth, shaped not by her actions but by the fears of those who needed someone to hold accountable for their misfortunes. The transformation of her label happened so gradually that no one could later say when the word witch first fell upon her. The term did not arrive like a verdict. It crept in quietly, born from whispered conversations, slipping into stories told to children who asked too many questions. The land reinforced it. The river fog gathered thick around her part of the woods, curling around her hut as if drawn to it. Those who ventured near spoke of strange scents and odd sounds that followed them home. When the community faced hardship, they looked toward the deep woods and imagined her eyes watching them from within. The term evil came later still, during a season when the river ran strangely low and fishermen returned empty-handed. It was not her doing. Yet someone had to bear the weight of explanation, and she was already standing at the edge of their fears. Her isolation became its own kind of evidence. Her silence became another. As stories grew, they shaped the air around her until her name, whatever it once had been, became swallowed by the legend being constructed in her absence. What is remembered is not the truth of her life but the outline drawn by others. And yet even in those early whispers there was a sense of ambiguity. Not all feared her. Some pitied her, believing she had been wronged in ways time no longer records. A few said she was simply a woman who wanted peace and solitude, a desire rarely granted in a land that demanded constant interaction for survival. The nickname that clung to her reveals more about the people who coined it than about the woman herself. It shows a community wrestling with hardship, uncertainty, and the unknown terrain around them. The witch they imagined was a shadow shaped by their anxieties, a vessel into which they poured every unease they could not name. Still, the image endured. It lingered through nights when storms rolled across the river, rattling the windows of cabins. It deepened whenever a traveler emerged from the woods with a story about a flicker of movement or a strange mark carved into a tree. Soon the idea of her felt older than the settlement itself, as though she had always been part of the land. In time, children dared each other to go near her clearing. They returned breathless, claiming they heard her singing or chanting, though no one could agree on the melody or the words. Hunters avoided her territory out of respect or fear, though they never admitted which one guided their decisions. Her reputation grew until she became both a warning and a legend, a figure invoked to quiet restlessness and explain the inexplicable. Through all these murmurs, one detail appeared again and again. At dusk, a thin column of smoke often rose from the woods where she lived, drifting upward in the still air. It was never thick enough to signal danger, never wild enough to call for help. It was simply a presence, a sign that she existed somewhere beyond the boundary of ordinary life. For some, the smoke represented menace. For others, it symbolized endurance, the quiet persistence of someone living according to her own design. Whatever meaning people attached to it, the smoke became the earliest emblem of her story, a visual thread tying her existence to the land. Those who watched it from afar felt that the woods themselves breathed through that single rising plume. It suggested ritual for some, simple survival for others, but always it stirred the imagination. As the settlement grew and years unfolded, the image of that drifting smoke lodged itself into the collective memory of Yazoo. Even long after her death, people would point toward the tree line at dusk and speak of her. They would say that the woods still remembered her footsteps, that the river still carried whispers of her name, that the smoke rising from her hut had been a message they never fully understood. And now, as her story begins, the river lies quiet once more. The evening deepens. The last light fades behind the trees. In the distance, a faint trail of smoke rises, steady and pale, dissolving slowly into the darkening sky. It hovers there, unmoving, waiting to lead us deeper into the life of the woman whose legend would shape Yazoo for generations. The faint ember beside the fallen tree rests in the quiet understory as though it has been waiting for centuries, a small pulse of fading warmth nestled in the cool moss. It glows without urgency, soft and steady, shaping the doorway into the story of her first lesson, a lesson not written in books or spoken aloud but pressed into the rhythm of her wandering life. In those early years, when she was still only the woman of the woods and not yet the figure whispered about along the Yazoo River, she learned how swiftly perception could shift, how quickly a quiet life could become a mirror for the unsettled minds of others. She had taken to the forest for reasons that remain hidden, reasons the land absorbed and guarded with the loyalty of an old friend. But solitude teaches its own truths, and the woods are a patient instructor. She learned to listen for the change in wind that signaled a coming storm. She learned the creak of the trees as they bent in the evening air. She understood the patterns of river animals, the delicate signs left by deer in the undergrowth, the constellations of mushrooms that revealed hidden dampness in the soil. All of this shaped her path, yet these were not the lessons that defined her fate. The lesson that mattered most came from people, not nature, and it began on a day when her silence was misread for the first time. A young boy had wandered into the woods, following the shimmer of dragonflies along a narrow game trail. He lost his way as shadows lengthened, and fear tightened around him while the last light of afternoon slipped through the branches. She found him crouched beside a fallen log, trembling and unable to recall the direction home. She said nothing, for silence was the language she trusted, but she extended her hand, guiding him gently through the trees until the clearing of his settlement appeared. The boy ran to his family with a cry of relief, but when he spoke of the woman who had led him back, the family's gratitude intertwined with suspicion. Why had she been so deep in the woods alone? Why had the boy not heard her approach? How could she appear so suddenly in the failing light? Gratitude blurred into unease, and unease began its slow transformation into fear. That evening marked the shift. It was the moment she realized that deeds do not speak louder than perception, that even kindness can be recast under the weight of expectation. The boy's family did not accuse her outright, but their voices carried the tremor of discomfort. She felt it in the way they avoided her eyes when she passed near their fields in the days that followed, in the way conversations fell silent as she approached the trading post for salt or cloth. She understood then that people feared what lived beyond their fences, not because it threatened them, but because it lay beyond their control. This realization settled into her like a stone, and from that moment on, she moved through the world with deeper caution. She kept her distance from the settlement, gathering herbs at dawn when others still slept, and fishing along the quieter bends of the river where the touch of morning light barely reached. Even so, the land could not shield her from the growing murmurs. They shifted like wind through tall reeds, soft at first, barely noticeable, yet the words carried weight. People wondered aloud why she chose a life of solitude, why she lived without family or companion, why she returned their greetings with nods instead of speech. Silence became her signature, and silence became her indictment. The turning point arrived during a late autumn fire that began as a spark in a pile of drying brush. Flames leapt across the settlement with a speed no one had anticipated. Panic rippled through the cabins as families fought to keep the fire from spreading. She saw the smoke from her dwelling and hurried toward the settlement with a bucket in hand, joining the line of people passing water from hand to hand. The fire was subdued, the danger past, yet gratitude for her help never formed. Instead, someone whispered that she had been seen near the fields earlier in the day. Someone else claimed she had been gathering strange herbs near the brush. A third insisted that the wind had shifted in an unusual way, as though responding to her presence. The fire, though accidental, became intertwined with her in the minds of those searching for patterns in misfortune. That moment marked the first time she felt the boundary tightening around her. A community struggling under difficult seasons needed a cause for their suffering, and she fit the shape of their fear too easily. She was quiet, solitary, different. Her ways did not resemble theirs, and difference has always been the simplest target for suspicion. She withdrew even further, not out of resentment but out of recognition. The lesson that unfolded before her was not a lesson of malice or confrontation. It was a lesson in the fragile architecture of reputation. A single spark, literal or imagined, could illuminate suspicion in the minds of many. She understood that she would never fully belong among them, not because the land had shaped her differently, but because their stories required a figure standing at the edge of the known world. That role is rarely chosen by the one who fills it. Days lengthened into years, and she observed the settlement from a distance. She saw children grow and elders fade. She watched the patterns of planting and harvest unfold with the rhythm of the seasons. Her life became intertwined with theirs, not through contact, but through the silent web of observation that connects all people who share the same land. She noticed that each misfortune brought new whispers about her, while each blessing passed without mention. This imbalance revealed the true nature of the lesson. People remember only the stories that reinforce their fears, never the stories that soften them. She learned to accept this without bitterness. She did not fight the rumors or defend her intentions. Instead, she chose to walk her path with measured steps, trusting the woods to carry her weight when human judgment faltered. The fallen tree, near which the ember cooled, was one she had passed many times. It had come down during a storm several winters earlier, and its trunk now lay covered in moss and fungi. She often paused near it, placing her hand on the bark as if greeting an old friend. It grounded her, reminding her of the quiet resilience of the natural world. The ember beside it now, imagined or real, served as a symbol of her first lesson, the slow burn of misunderstanding spreading through the settlement. She knew that stories, once lit, do not easily extinguish. They smolder long after the truth has faded, carrying their own glow, shaping their own shadows. As the ember dims further, shrinking into the soft texture of the forest floor, its faint light echoes the moment her fate began to shift. It marks the point at which her solitude ceased to be simply a way of life and became instead the canvas upon which others painted their fears. The ember cools to a final flicker and then to stillness, leaving only the memory of its glow. And in that lingering glow, the path rises toward the next stage of her story, toward the height of the legend that would one day cast her as something far larger than the woman she truly was. The ember that once glowed beside the fallen tree has surrendered its final spark, yet its memory lingers in the dim understory like a breath held too long. That faint afterglow becomes the quiet bridge into the moment when her story rose to its greatest height, not through triumph but through the expanding shadow of rumor that stretched across the Yazoo settlement like a slow, encroaching dusk. This was the summit of her legend, the point at which her presence, whether real or imagined, began to shape the thoughts of an entire community. It began with a season that carried more weight than those before it. The river ran lower than anyone could remember, exposing stones that had slept unseen beneath its surface for generations. Fish grew scarce. Fields hardened under relentless sun. Families who had once spoken confidently of harvests began to whisper about omens in the soil. Hardship has a way of sharpening old fears, and in that long summer the settlers looked more often toward the woods, toward the quiet space where she lived, toward the narrow trails that wound between oaks and cypress, and disappeared into her solitude. The more the land resisted them, the more certain they became that their misfortune had a human shape. And because she had already been marked by caution, their minds settled upon her with unsettling ease. They spoke of seeing lights flickering deep in the forest at night. They spoke of hearing strange calls at the edge of the tree line, though no two people agreed on the sound. One described a humming, another a whisper, another a cry carried by the wind. Each account contradicted the last, yet all pointed in the same direction. Fear does not require consistency. It requires only repetition, and repetition grew abundant in those weeks. Children who had once heard stories of her with curiosity now avoided the riverbank after dusk. Traders passing through asked about the figure in the woods, as though the settlement itself had absorbed the tale and now exhaled it through every conversation. Even travelers who had never set eyes upon her began recounting rumors as though they were witnesses. In this way, her legend climbed toward its summit, led not by her actions but by the imagination of those who needed to make sense of their suffering. They said she kept strange tokens near her doorway, bones arranged in patterns only she could interpret. They spoke of herbs hung to dry in shapes that looked like twisted symbols. They recalled her calm expression as she walked past their cabins, reading it not as tranquility but as hidden knowledge. In truth, her dwelling was simple. Her herbs were those used by anyone living close to the land. The patterns they feared were simply the arrangement the wind created as it moved through branches, scattering the remnants of seasons across the clearing. Yet once a story takes root, it grows with little regard for the soil in which it was planted. Her greatest moment of influence, this so-called summit, was defined entirely by the fears of others. She felt it in the way footsteps halted when she approached a path. She felt it in the way families gathered their children close when she passed near their fields, and she felt it most keenly in the shift of the land itself. The woods, once her refuge, became heavy with the weight of unspoken stories. Each rustle of leaves, each crack of a distant branch, carried an echo of the community's judgment. She found herself avoiding the settlement altogether, not out of fear but out of awareness that her presence, once merely tolerated, had now become a catalyst for unease. Yet even in her isolation, she sensed the turning tide. One evening, while gathering water along the riverbank, she noticed two figures watching her from behind a stand of reeds. They did not approach, but she felt their gaze like a draft against her skin. As she straightened, they turned away and disappeared into the shadowed path leading back to the cabins. Her solitude was no longer enough. Her distance, once a shield, now served as the very reason they feared her. Still, she did not alter her life. She moved through her days with the same quiet rhythm she had always known, trusting the forest to remain neutral where humans could not. But neutrality shifts when stories deepen. Soon the settlement began attributing every misfortune to her. When a storm tore through the fields and flattened rows of corn, they spoke of her glare as she stood at the river the day before. When a livestock illness spread among the herds, they recalled her gathering a certain plant near the pastures, though none could name which plant it had been. Illness, drought, lost tools, broken fences, each became a thread woven into her growing myth. It did not matter that she had no hand in these events. Legends do not require truth to take shape. They require only a persistent rhythm, a pulse of repetition that grows stronger with each telling. And as summer deepened into autumn, that rhythm intensified. Her name, or the name they had given her, began to carry weight. People spoke it quietly, as if saying it aloud might summon her, though no one could explain what they feared she might do. Fear had lifted her to a height she never sought. The summit of her influence was not a moment of power but a moment of distortion. She had become larger in story than she had ever been in life. She felt this shift one night as she stood beside the fallen tree where the ember had once glowed. The forest seemed to hold its breath. The wind barely moved. Somewhere in the distance, the echo of footsteps drifted toward the riverbank, faint yet deliberate. She could not see who made them, but she felt the weight of the sound as it carried through the trees. It was not the cautious step of a hunter or the uncertain tread of a traveler. It was purposeful, like someone searching for evidence to support a belief already forming. She understood then that the summit of her legend was nothing more than the height of their fear. And once fear peaks, it must find a downward path. The echo lingered in the air long after the footsteps themselves had faded. It was a sound that would follow her story for generations, a reminder that at the height of her influence she had not spoken a single word to defend herself. Silence had shaped her life, and silence had shaped her myth. At the river's edge, she watched the pale glimmer of moonlight ripple across the water. She felt the current tug at the hem of her garment, gentle but insistent. It reminded her that the river moved on regardless of human imagination, carrying with it the stories people left behind. She wondered then how long her name would cling to their minds, how far the tale would travel before settling into the quiet corners of memory where truth dissolves into legend. The summit passed not with an act but with a sound. The echo of distant footsteps moving toward the riverbank marked the peak of her transformation in the eyes of the settlement. It signaled the beginning of a shift she could not yet name, but sensed all the same. For legends do not remain at their height. They move, they bend, they reshape themselves according to the needs of those who tell them. And as the echo fades into the wide silence of the Yazoo woods, her story prepares to descend into the symbol that would one day define her more sharply than any truth ever could. Part 3. The echo of footsteps that once drifted toward the riverbank stretches onward into a softer quiet now, as though the forest itself has inhaled the sound and allowed only the memory of it to linger in the branches. That lingering echo becomes the doorway into the part of her story shaped not by whispers or glances but by the creation of a symbol, an object or gesture that settled into the heart of the legend and hardened there like cooled resin. Every tale that outlasts its teller eventually condenses into something tangible, something people can point to when words fail, and for the woman whom Yazoo would one day call the evil witch, that symbol emerged from the meeting of fire and silence. It was not born in a single moment but accumulated slowly, gathering meaning through repetition, through fear, through the human need to crystallize the intangible. In her case, the symbol began as nothing more than the charred clearing where her dwelling stood. For years she had lived in the quiet shelter of the trees, her small hut leaning slightly as if listening to the wind. It was a simple structure, built from fallen branches and river clay, yet it carried the scent of herbs, smoke, and the steady companionship of solitude. And then, without warning, it was gone. Some said they saw flames rising through the canopy one night, brief but bright, swallowed quickly by the darkness. Others claimed they saw only a faint glow, as though embers smoldered for hours without spreading. No one approached, the settlement had grown too wary of her to intervene. By morning, the hut had collapsed into itself, leaving only a ring of charred wood and the faint smell of burnt earth. Whether the fire began by accident or intention became irrelevant. What mattered to the community was the image left behind. A blackened circle deep in the woods, untouched by footprints, silent except for the occasional creak of cooling timber. This clearing became the settlement's symbol of her power, or what they believed her power to be. They spoke of the fire as a sign, though each person assigned it a different meaning. Some saw it as evidence that she had been performing rituals too dangerous for mortals. Others claimed she had been consumed by her own curse, vanishing in the flames. A few insisted that she had escaped into the shadows to avoid being confronted. None of these accounts carried certainty, yet all fed the growing belief that her presence had transcended the ordinary. The charred clearing gave shape to these ideas. It was a place people could approach cautiously, peering from a distance, feeling the hairs rise on their arms as they imagined the moment of destruction. The clearing became a place of silence. Not because nothing lived there, but because people spoke in hushed tones whenever they passed. They avoided stepping inside its boundary, convinced that something lingered in the air above the scorched earth. In time, the blackened remnants of her hut came to represent the moment the settlement believed she crossed from human to something other. The clearing marked the point where fact dissolved fully into superstition. And yet, another symbol emerged, smaller and more delicate than the clearing itself. In the ashes near the riverbank, someone found a branch, charred but intact, its surface polished smooth by heat. It lay half submerged in still water, as though carried there by the current or placed intentionally. Children who stumbled upon it were frightened at first, claiming it pulsed with warmth or whispered when the wind shifted. Adults dismissed these tales yet refused to touch the branch themselves. Instead, it remained in the shallow water for days, then weeks, becoming a focal point for stories that grew with each retelling. Some said it was a tool she had used to draw symbols in the dirt. Others believed it was a charm of protection or a sign she left for those who wished to understand her. The branch itself remained silent, drifting slightly with each ripple of the Yazoo River, its blackened surface catching the faint light of dusk. In the stillness of evening, it seemed almost to float above the water rather than rest within it. And though the branch carried no inscription, no markings, no indication of purpose, it became the second symbol of her tale, a reminder that remnants of destruction often hold deeper meaning than their origins suggest. Over time, the branch and the clearing merged into a single story. People would speak of the fire and then mention the branch, or speak of the branch and recall the fire, until the two separate events fused into one narrative that reinforced her reputation. The settlement no longer spoke of the woman whose kindness had once guided a lost child home or who had helped quench the autumn fire. They spoke instead of the woman whose dwelling burned under mysterious circumstances and whose charred branch floated in river water as though defying natural law. And so the symbol became a vessel for belief, carrying the weight of what they feared and what they admired, for even their fear held a quiet reverence. Those who ventured near the river at dusk sometimes thought they saw the branch shift its place, drifting with unseen currents. They whispered that she had touched the river before leaving, that she had imbued it with something lasting, something that could not be explained by the rational mind. And perhaps the most enduring aspect of the symbol was not the branch itself but the stillness surrounding it. People who approached the riverbank described an unusual hush, as though the water paused in its movement. Birds avoided the area, the air felt heavy. Even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb the space where the branch lay. This quiet became part of the legend. It wove itself into conversations, into lullabies, into warnings spoken to children who wandered too far. And each retelling added another layer to the symbol, shaping it not as an object but as a mirror, reflecting the settlement's growing belief that her presence had not vanished with the fire. For symbols rarely remain confined to the past. They reach forward, touching events yet to unfold, guiding the way stories settle in memory. The branch continued to rest in the water long after the clearing cooled. It lay under moonlight, catching the silver glow of night. It lay under rain, softened by steady drops that blurred its edges. It lay under fog, almost disappearing into the gray mist that drifted across the river. And through all these changes, the settlement watched, wondering whether the symbol marked an end or a beginning. For some, it represented her final gesture, the last residue of her life. For others, it symbolized her lingering power, a sign that she had not truly left the woods. The truth remained hidden, carried only by the river, which offered no answers. Eventually, the branch sank deeper into the still water, its charred surface darkening until it could no longer be seen from the riverbank. Yet the memory of it did not sink. It hung in the air like the faint scent of smoke after a dying fire. The settlement spoke of it long after it disappeared, convinced that its presence had been a message they never fully understood. And as the branch descends into the river's quiet depth, a soft sound emerges, subtle yet persistent, the gentle tapping of water against river stones. That sound, steady and patient, becomes the threshold leading into the next chapter of her life, carrying with it the symbols left behind and the stories yet to unfold. The soft tapping of water against river stones lingers like a quiet pulse, steady enough to soothe yet insistent enough to guide the mind into the next movement of her story, a story that now drifts through the stages of her life the way the current drifts around bends and fallen branches. The tapping becomes the first sound of a new understanding, a reminder that time is not a single path but a sequence of shifting banks, widening and narrowing as the moments of a life unfold. Her youth, adulthood, and final years moved in similar currents, each shaped not only by what she chose but by what the land and the people around her demanded of her. The woman the settlement came to fear did not begin her life as an omen. She began much as every life begins, with a search for belonging, with a need for quiet, with a desire to understand the natural world. The early years of her youth had been spent in a different settlement, far from the Yazoo woods, a place where expectations pressed tightly around every household, and where her curiosity about the plants that grew wild along the riverbanks was considered a distraction from her duties. She learned early that those who listened closely to the forest were often misunderstood by those who listened only to one another. When she reached adulthood, she followed the pull of solitude until it led her to the Yazoo land, drawn by a sense that this place, with its deep silence and expansive woods, would allow her to live without the constant murmur of judgment. She built her dwelling with careful hands, each branch placed with intention, each stone arranged to hold back the wind. Those early days in the woods shaped her understanding of herself. She discovered that silence did not frighten her. It steadied her. She learned that loneliness, when chosen, is not a burden but a form of clarity. Her life unfolded with a kind of slow grace, measured by the turning of seasons rather than by the expectations of others. She moved through spring with the same steady patience she carried through winter, gathering what she needed, mending what broke, and observing the patterns of nature with the devotion of someone who recognized the forest as a living companion. Yet even as she embraced the rhythms of the land, the echo of humanity remained close enough to tug at the edges of her days. She heard distant laughter from the settlement on warm evenings, saw thin trails of smoke rise from their chimneys, and occasionally crossed paths with travelers seeking shelter or guidance. Most passed without remark. A few paused to exchange quiet words, though she often responded more with gesture than with speech. Talking had always felt to her like stepping into a shallow pool that concealed a deeper current beneath. Words could carry misunderstanding, and she preferred clarity. As the years passed, she grew into her solitude the way a tree grows into its roots, firmly and with quiet purpose. But time does not allow any life to remain in a single stage. The changes that came were subtle at first. Her steps grew slower, her sleep lighter. The forest that had once felt expansive began to feel familiar in every detail, each bend in the trail mapped by memory. She reached an age when the body begins to speak more often than the mind, reminding her of the years she had carried. Still, she did not fear the approach of her later days. She saw life as a cycle rather than a line, and old age was simply a season with its own rhythm. During the decline of her strength, when the fire in her hut needed coaxing and the weight of gathering fallen limbs felt heavier than before, the settlement's stories grew louder. She noticed fewer travelers passing her dwelling. She sensed the distance between her and the community thickening like fog. Even the woods seemed to hold their breath, responding to the shift in the air around her. The stages of her life had brought her from youthful curiosity to adult independence to the quiet dignity of age, yet the settlement saw only the woman who remained unchanged in her solitude. To them, the passing years intensified her mystery. They imagined her aging differently, as though the woods preserved her in ways that defied nature. They spoke of her being older than she appeared, of her eyes carrying ancient knowledge. These exaggerations took root in their stories until her humanity blurred beneath the narrative they created. And as her bodily strength waned, the settlement's fear grew more heightened, as though her vulnerability made her more dangerous. This contradiction revealed the truth of how they perceived her. She was no longer a person but a figure onto whom they projected every uncertainty they could not name. Her later years unfolded in the quiet refuge of the forest, where she found comfort in the simple repetition of tending the fire, preparing herbs, sitting beside the river, and feeling the cool breeze on her face. She often listened to the tapping of water against stones, the same sound that now guides the memory of her story. To her, it was a reminder that even as life shifts, there are rhythms that remain constant. But to those who observed her from a distance, her routines became rituals, her quiet moments became ceremonies, her solitude became power. In time, the natural transitions of her life were misunderstood as transformations of another kind. People said she grew stronger in the woods, even as she aged. They said her silence deepened because she communed with forces unseen. They cast her natural changes as unnatural signs. It did not matter that she felt the normal aches of age, that her hands trembled when the mornings were cold, that her breath grew thin after long walks. The legend they shaped could not allow her to be human. And so the stages of her life, which had flowed with the calm inevitability of a river passing from source to delta, were rewritten into a narrative of increasing mystery. By the time she reached her final years, the settlement believed she was something more than a solitary woman living in the woods. She had become a threshold figure, someone standing between the world of the living and something beyond it. Even her ordinary presence near the river was interpreted as a sign. Some said she waited for the water to deliver messages. Others said she spoke to the trees. None understood that she stood by the river simply because it comforted her, because its steady voice reminded her that all things move, all things shift, all things eventually return to the quiet from which they came. In the final stage of her life, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this land. She thought of the settlement whose fear had shaped her identity. She thought of the forest that had embraced her without question. She thought of the river whose song had accompanied her through every season. She did not see her life as tragic or lonely. She saw it as complete, shaped by choice and by circumstance, shaped by the land and by the breath of time. And yet, even as she reached the quiet acceptance of her final years, the world around her shifted once more. The tapping of the water against stones softened, blurring into a murmuring rhythm, a reminder that every stage ends and leads into something else, something unseen but always approaching. And in that soft murmur, something new began to form. The outline of a philosophy and the figure who would one day guard her story from vanishing entirely. The soft murmur that rises from the river, gentle as breath against the surface of the water, drifts onward into the space where her philosophy begins to take shape, subtle at first, like a thought forming in the half-light between waking and sleep. It is not a doctrine she crafted deliberately, nor a creed she ever spoke aloud, but rather a quiet understanding shaped by years spent listening to the forest, watching the river shift with the seasons, and observing the settlement from a distance. Her philosophy grew the way moss gathers on stone, naturally, slowly, without design. It rested on the belief that the world reveals itself through silence more clearly than through words, that the land speaks in rhythms too steady for hurried minds to hear. She came to understand that nothing in nature exists without purpose, yet nothing demands recognition for fulfilling it. The trees did not ask to be admired, the river did not plead to be respected. They simply moved in accordance with their nature, steady and unresisting, yielding without surrendering, shaping their surroundings by existing fully in each moment. She took this as her guide, living with unspoken acceptance of the world's indifference and its quiet generosity. This belief did not shield her from suffering, nor did it offer her comfort when the settlement's fear grew louder, but it gave her a way to remain whole when others tried to shape her into something she was not. She learned to carry herself with calm, not because calmness was easy, but because she understood that resistance often feeds the very forces one wishes to weaken. Her silence, which others saw as mystery or defiance, was simply her method of moving through a world that had rarely listened when she spoke. Through this silence, she discovered a deeper truth, that solitude sharpens perception, and perception reveals the currents beneath human behavior. She saw how the settlers' fear rose not from malice but from uncertainty, how their stories grew because they needed meaning in their struggles, how they turned her into a symbol because symbols are easier to confront than the unknown. Her philosophy taught her not to condemn them for this. Instead, she observed them with the same gentle distance she offered the river, understanding that every creature seeks a way to place its fears outside itself. Yet this understanding, quiet and internal, could not alter the direction of her life. It shaped her inner self, but it did not soften the suspicion that clung to her. And as the settlement's stories darkened, as the fire that destroyed her dwelling hardened into legend, her philosophy became both her refuge and her burden. It allowed her to accept her fate, but it also meant she bore the weight of their fear without protest. Still, no philosophy endures on its own. Every belief, no matter how steady, survives because someone carries it forward or remembers it long after its originator has vanished. In her story, this role fell not to the settlement that feared her, nor to the children who whispered her name by firelight, but to a figure who lived quietly on the margins of their world, someone who saw her humanity long before others lost sight of it. This guardian of her story was an unlikely witness, a young woman who often wandered into the woods not out of defiance but out of a yearning for stillness. She was neither a child nor fully grown, living in that tender space where the world's expectations begin pressing in, but where the heart still seeks something honest and unfiltered. She found the forest soothing, a place where she could breathe without feeling the weight of others' demands. On one of her wanderings, long before the fire consumed the hut, she encountered the woman of the woods. It was not a dramatic meeting. It was simple, almost unremarkable. The girl had paused beside a fallen tree, listening to the quiet, when she noticed the solitary figure gathering herbs nearby. The woman did not speak. She offered a nod, light as a leaf drifting in air. The girl returned the gesture. Something in that exchange softened the veil of fear the settlement had draped over her. From that day forward, the girl watched her with a gentler curiosity, observing the way she moved through the forest, the care she took not to disturb the land, the patience with which she tended her fire. She never approached too closely, sensing that the woman valued distance not out of hostility but out of preference. But she paid attention. She listened to the silence around her. She saw the difference between the creature of legend and the quiet figure who lived in harmony with the woods. Years later, when her parents spoke warnings about the witch in the forest, she held her tongue, knowing their stories did not match what she had witnessed. When the fire destroyed the hut and the settlement whispered about rituals and curses, she alone returned to the woods to see what remained. She found the charred clearing, the ashes, the faint smell of burnt timber. But she also saw the small details others had overlooked, the way the earth had been swept clear of debris, as if the woman had prepared for the fire, the way certain herbs lay arranged neatly on a stone, untouched by flame, the way the remains of the hut seemed more collapsed than destroyed, as if it had fallen inward rather than been consumed. She noticed these things not because she sought meaning, but because she The soft murmur that rises from the river becomes a low, continuous thread, guiding us into the quiet interior of her beliefs, the philosophy shaped not by doctrine or instruction, but by the long companionship of solitude, of wind, of earth, of water flowing endlessly past the roots of cypress trees. This philosophy did not arrive in her life as a revelation, but as something gathered slowly, the way dew collects on leaves overnight, unseen until morning light reveals its shimmer. It formed from the countless days she spent walking the same forest paths, from listening to the layered sounds of the woods and recognizing that none of them sought to dominate or explain the others. She learned early that the natural world offered no praise, no condemnation, only existence, and this awareness became the foundation of her understanding. She believed that all things carried a quiet purpose, that life did not bend itself to human wishes but unfolded according to patterns deeper than intention. Her guiding thought, though she never spoke it aloud, was that the world remained indifferent to both fear and hope, and that this indifference was not cruelty but balance. In the stillness of her dwelling, she often watched the flame of her small fire lean as the wind shifted. The fire did not resist the wind, nor did it surrender entirely. It simply adapted to its presence. She saw in that movement a reflection of how a life could be lived, bending when needed, burning steadily when possible, accepting the change of direction without imagining it to be a loss. Over time, this quiet belief shaped the way she moved through the forest, the way she approached her days, the way she regarded the settlement whose judgments had once unsettled her. She did not hate them for misunderstanding her. She saw them as people held tightly by fear, fear of the unknown, fear of solitude, fear of the land that surrounded them and did not speak their language. Her philosophy taught her that people often see the world not as it is but as they fear it might be, and so she walked gently along the edges of their lives, leaving space for their unease. Yet no philosophy survives alone. Every story, even one born of solitude, finds someone who carries it forward, someone who becomes a guardian not by choice but by circumstance, drawn to the quiet truth that others overlook. For her, that guardian emerged in the form of an aging trapper known for traveling the length of the Yazoo River in a narrow canoe. He was a man shaped by silence as she was, one who understood the forest without needing to name each of its secrets. He would sometimes find himself crossing her path in the deeper woods, where both of them moved lightly, disturbing as little of the land as possible. Their exchanges were not marked by conversation, but by mutual recognition, a nod, a glance, a shared pause at the river's edge. She sensed in him a quietness similar to her own, a mind untroubled by the myths that others gathered like tinder. He, too, lived at a distance from the settlement, visiting only when necessary, never lingering long. When he did hear the stories spoken about her, he listened without accepting them, knowing well the human tendency to fill silence with invention. In time, he became the quiet observer of her life, noticing how she moved through the woods with care, how she tended the small rituals of survival, how she seemed more at ease among the trees than among people. He did not seek to protect her in any dramatic way. Instead, he protected the truth of her existence in his own memory, holding it steady even as the settlement's tales twisted into darker shapes. He became the one who would later speak of her not as a witch, but as a woman who understood the land better than those who feared it. Though he knew her only in passing, he trusted the authenticity of those brief encounters more than the elaborate stories woven by others. The forest itself seemed to acknowledge this connection. Birds did not startle when he approached. The river did not resist the movement of his canoe. He carried a presence that aligned with hers, not through kinship, but through shared respect for the world that held them both. On rare occasions he would find small traces of her passing, a piece of woven reed placed carefully beside a trail, a stone arranged atop another stone, as though marking a moment of thought, a circle of herbs drying on a flat rock near the water. These small gestures revealed her inner world more clearly than any spoken philosophy. They showed a patient trust in the land and a reverence for the quiet patterns guiding her life. He never disturbed them. recognizing them not as rituals but as expressions of a mind attentive to detail and meaning. And so, when her life began to fold toward its final days, it was the trapper who understood most clearly what the settlement could not: that she had sought nothing from them, that her solitude was not a threat but a refuge, that the stories they feared were reflections of their own uncertainties. In his memory, she remained human, flawed, resilient, contemplative, not the figure of curse and shadow that would later dominate the legend. After her death, when the story of the fire and the curse spread through Yazoo City, it was he who carried the quieter story of her life, whispering it to those who would listen, ensuring that some portion of truth survived beneath the weight of myth. He became the guardian of her memory, not to erase the legend but to preserve the humanity buried within it. And now, as the dusk deepens and the river quiets once more, a faint voice seems to rise from the woods, not her voice exactly, but the final line she left behind, a line spoken not aloud but through the way she lived, that the world does not bend to fear, and that every life, no matter how misunderstood, leaves a soft imprint on the land that holds it. That quiet line hovers in the air like a breath suspended at the edge of night, guiding us into the moment when her story reaches its end. The quiet line she left behind settles into the dusk like a final exhalation, and from that fading breath rises the shape of her ending, not abrupt but inevitable, the last descent of a lifelong, entwined with the forest's silence. Death does not always arrive in a single moment. Sometimes it gathers like mist along the river, first faint, then steady, until the world is wrapped in it without noticing when the process began. In her final days, the forest around her seemed to darken gently, as though preparing itself for her departure. The trees held their leaves more still, the river's current softened. Even the wind passed through her clearing with a kind of reverence, stirring the ashes of old seasons without scattering them. Yet while the land sensed her decline, the settlement remained too entangled in its own stories to perceive the quiet truth unfolding on the edge of their world. They had grown accustomed to the idea that her presence carried danger, so when a fire later broke across their town, consuming buildings with a hunger that seemed almost purposeful, they reached immediately for her name. It did not matter that she had already weakened, that her body no longer carried her far from her dwelling, that she had not set foot near their fences in months. Fear remembers its chosen shape, and for them she remained the figure who could be blamed when flames rose against the night sky. They spoke of her curse before the ashes had even cooled. They insisted she had foretold the fire in gestures they once ignored. They imagined her standing in the shadows with eyes reflecting the blaze, as though she had summoned it with a final breath. These stories traveled faster than truth, reaching ears that needed explanation more than accuracy. While the town raged and then quieted in smoke, she lay alone in her hut, a dwindling flame beside a dwindling life. Her ending was not marked by spectacle or incantation, it was marked by stillness. She had collapsed near the doorway, her hand resting on the frame as though she had meant to step outside and greet the day but lacked the strength to finish the motion. Her eyes remained open, soft rather than fixed, reflecting the dim light of the forest canopy. There was no sign of struggle, no sign of fear. Her passing had the shape of a candle extinguished by a warm hand rather than a cold wind. It was the trapper who found her. He had sensed her absence in the woods, noticed the lack of her light at dusk, the missing trace of her footsteps along the river path. When he entered her clearing and saw her still form, he stood for a long moment without moving, understanding that silence had reclaimed someone who had lived within it more faithfully than any other he had known. He knelt beside her and felt the coolness of her hand. He did not speak. Words would have been unnecessary. Instead, he sat with her for a time to honor the life she had lived, listening to the forest breathe around them, the world continuing in its unbroken rhythm. Before leaving, he closed her eyes with a gentle touch, knowing that the settlement would soon distort the manner of her death as easily as they had distorted her life. And so it happened. When her body was later discovered by a group from the settlement drawn, not by concern but by the need to confirm rumors, they found a scene they were unprepared to accept. There was no curse etched into the dirt, no unnatural sign carved into the trees, no remnants of spells or rituals. But the human mind, once committed to fear, does not surrender quickly. They interpreted her peaceful posture as unnatural calm. They saw the extinguished fire in her hearth as proof of ritual. They spoke of the faint scent of herbs as though it were a warning. Someone noticed a single cracked bowl near her bedside and claimed it had been used for sorcery. Another pointed to the absence of footprints around her hut and declared she had died the way witches do, vanishing from the world before collapsing back into it. Every detail of her passing became twisted into confirmation of what they already believed. Her death, instead of dissolving their fears, solidified the legend. And yet the truth of her final moment lived quietly within the memory of the trapper, the only one who saw the simplicity and dignity of her departure. He carried that memory with him as he walked back to the river, knowing it would be lost beneath the force of the stories spreading through Yazoo. As the settlement shaped her death into myth, a final whisper seemed to rise from the woods, though it came only from the stirring of leaves. They said she had spoken a last word, a final condemnation of the town that feared her. Some claimed she uttered a promise that Yazoo City would burn. Some claimed she warned that the land would never forget the injustice she suffered. Others said her voice echoed even after she died. But no one heard her true last word, because she never spoke one aloud. The last word she left was written not in speech but in the posture of her quiet acceptance, a wordless closing of the life she had lived without asking anything in return. And yet, the mythic last word, the one the town invented, became the version history remembered. People spoke of it as though it had been carved into the air, a curse carried into the future by every gust of wind that passed through the Yazoo woods. In the nights after her death, settlers claimed to see smoke rising where no fire should be, a thin gray column drifting between the trees, dissolving before it reached the sky. Some said it was her spirit returning. Others said it was a warning, but it was nothing more than the lingering image of a life the town never understood, the final breath of a story already slipping into legend. And from that faint column of impossible smoke, her legacy begins to take shape. The faint column of smoke rising where no fire should be lifts into the night like a question. The land itself is reluctant to answer, and from that wavering thread the shape of her legacy emerges, not sharp or certain but wide and drifting, settling into the spaces between history and memory. Legends rarely leave the world in the same form they entered it, and hers did not dissolve with her death. Instead, it expanded, carried forward by people who needed the story more than they needed the truth. Smoke became the enduring image attached to her name, a reminder of the fire that consumed her hut, the town blaze she was blamed for, and the whispered curse that followed. Yet, like all symbols, the smoke changed each time someone retold her tale. In the early years after her passing, the settlement spoke of her with a mixture of fear and reluctant fascination. They had lost much in the fire that swept through Yazoo, and in their grief they shaped her legend into a form that made sense of their suffering. They said she had caused the destruction because her spirit had been wronged. They said the fire was the final stroke of a curse she pronounced with her dying breath. Mothers repeated these words to children as warnings, shaping generations of belief. Travelers heard fragments of the story and carried them to neighboring towns, where each retelling stretched the edges of the tale, making her shadow longer, her power greater, her intentions darker. Over time, the legend reached places that had never known her, yet spoke her name with conviction, as though she had lived among them. In these far interpretations, she became less a woman and more an emblem of frontier fear, the embodiment of what happens when solitude and misunderstanding collide with the anxieties of a growing settlement. Her humanity faded from the narrative, replaced by the more convenient shape of a witch whose anger could ignite towns and whose memory lingered in the curling drift of smoke. And yet, beneath the broad sweep of myth, a quieter legacy remained, carried not by those who feared her, but by those who sensed the deeper truth beneath the exaggerated stories. The trapper who had been her silent guardian spoke of her seldom, but when he did, he described not a witch, but a woman who knew the forest and lived in harmony with it. He spoke of her patience, her care with the land, her unwavering calm. To the few who listened, he explained that her solitude was not a declaration of hostility, but a choice made from understanding that peace comes from listening more than speaking. His words never gained the force of myth. They did not travel far or multiply into legend. Yet they formed a small counterbalance to the larger tale, a hidden current of truth running beneath the surface of the river of stories that carried her name downstream. As decades passed, the land itself changed, and new generations grew up hearing the tale without knowing how much of it had been born from fear rather than memory. They visited the charred clearing as though it were a sacred site, imagining they could feel her presence in the stillness. They walked along the river searching for signs of the branch that once floated in the water, convinced that finding it would reveal some hidden meaning. Smoke, branch, clearing, each became a fragment in the mosaic of her legacy. And then the Great Fire came, sweeping through Yazoo City with a ferocity that defied explanation, destroying much of the town in a single night. In the aftermath, when people searched for a cause, her legend resurfaced like an old wound reopened by fresh pain. They recalled the curse she supposedly spoke before death, the warning no one had heeded, the fire that had consumed her hut years earlier. Though rational minds understood that the blaze had risen from natural circumstances, the human mind seeks patterns, and her story provided one with unsettling ease. The town revived her legend with renewed certainty, speaking her name not as a memory but as an active presence, as though she had reached from the afterlife to deliver judgment. Stories thickened again, solidifying the myth into something nearly immovable. But even this part of her legacy spoke more about the town than about her. It revealed how communities, confronted with forces beyond their control, turned to the past for answers, overlooking the truth in favor of explanation woven from older fears. Her existence became a canvas onto which each generation painted its own anxieties. In time, writers, travelers, and historians arrived, each drawn to the tale of the Yazoo witch. They collected versions of the story, comparing one person's memory with another, finding inconsistencies so vast that the truth dissolved between them like mist dissolving in early sunlight. Yet even as they recorded the contradictions, the smoke-like quality of her legend became part of its enduring allure. She became the figure people projected themselves onto, the misunderstood outsider, the feared healer, the cursed woman wronged by society, the spirit guarding the woods, the embodiment of vengeance, the protector of nature, the destroyer of towns. Every era reshaped her to reflect its own concerns. And still, beneath all these interpretations, something of her real presence remained faintly perceptible, like the quiet scent of herbs lingering in the air long after a fire has gone out. The land remembered her. Birds nesting in the branches above the clearing seemed to pause in their songs. The riverbank where she once stood carried an echo of her calm. Travelers described an unusual hush in the woods, a stillness that made them slow their steps without understanding why. Perhaps her truest legacy lies not in the curse she never spoke or the fires she never caused, but in the persistent reminder that stories are powerful enough to reshape a life long after it has ended. Her tale teaches that fear creates shadows larger than the figures who cast them, that solitude is often misinterpreted as menace, and that a misunderstood life can achieve a kind of immortality when transformed into legend. And so the smoke rising where no fire should be becomes the lasting image of her story, symbolizing not her power, but the enduring human need to explain what cannot be explained. As the smoke curls upward into the vast, quiet sky, dissolving into the night, it leaves behind only a faint drift of river fog moving gently along the water, carrying her memory forward into the soft darkness where history and myth continue to intertwine.